Welcome to Enlightened Omnivore, the monthly podcast that serves up a delicious mix of food, sustainability, and travel. I'm your host, Steve Sabaker, here to explore the wonders of mindful eating. Join me each month as I dig into the stories behind our food system, discover new ways to live sustainably, and embark on culinary adventures around the globe or right in your very own kitchen. Get ready to expand your palate and your mind, one bite at a time. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation. Today, I'm speaking with James Lum, Regional Sales Manager, Force of Nature Meats. James started out in the meat biz as a butcher, training at the Meat Hook and opening his own shop in 2013. And since then, he's held business development, R&D, and sales positions in this ever-growing world of responsibly sourced proteins. He's now on the team at Force of Nature, which really came to the forefront, at least for me, when it brought bison, elk, and other game meats to the grocery store. But now it's expanded to all kinds of regenerative proteins that it sources exclusively from a more virtuous system of regenerative meat production. We'll learn a little bit more about what that means. I wanted to chat with James today because he's seen this ever-evolving global meat supply system from several angles. He's been both in the trenches and now at a well-marketed, glossy consumer packaged goods company that is making regenerative agriculture more mainstream. Let's dive in and learn exactly what regenerative meats are and a little bit more about why James chose this line of work, and hopefully learn a little bit more about how we might be able to participate in regenerative meats more directly at home. Hey, James, welcome to Enlightened Omnivore.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Super flattering to be brought on board.
James, I really reached out to you because of your work. I'm familiar with the brand Force of Nature, which started out in the game meat space, right?
You could say that. I mean, I think we've always sold beef to some extent. It's been maybe not at the forefront of our marketing material. And then bison, I would say, has been kind of like, pun intended, the keystone of our repertoire or catalog or whatever you want to call it. What I like to say is actually it's been a nice way for us to enter the market. If we just kind of dove straight into beef or pork or chicken or whatever right off the bat, it'd be a pretty steep uphill battle, competing with the behemoths in the industry.
How would you define regenerative agriculture? This is a term that we're hearing a lot now. 5 years ago, I remember a rancher coming to me and saying, "Hey, I've got this URL, regenerative agriculture. You guys think it's going to be worth anything?" And I remember looking at my business partner going, "No way is anyone going to say that mouthful when they're looking for the kinds of proteins that they're sourcing." But of course, what do I know? It's all over the place now. How do you guys define it? What is regenerative agriculture to you?
Sure. At its core, it's a holistic model of farming or ranching that promotes and boosts ecological function, right? And that starts with building topsoils, and it ends with producing nutrient-dense foods and thriving communities. The intention is to better the environment, sequester carbon, and ultimately create a more benevolent and beneficial supply chain in the meat industry and beyond. So that's how I see it. That's how Force of Nature I would think would define it as well. And really beyond that, I mean, there's a lot of people throwing around regenerative agriculture right now, and whether or not their practices are truly regenerative, it's left up for debate.
So what does that look like to the layperson? I mean, if I'm driving down, somewhere out in Colorado or Texas, how does it look different if it's regenerative agriculture than let's say more traditional or commodity beef?
Sure. So at its core, it's rotational grazing, but it's a little bit more than that, right? We're looking at rotational grazing in kind of how it can be most impactful to building soil and not negatively impacting the diversity of the forage and the plant life and the biodiversity as far as the fauna is concerned as well.
Yeah. So when you said rotational grazing, I mean like mob grazing, right?
Right. Essentially, we want to manage the herds in a way that positively impacts the land. We don't want to overgraze it, so we don't want to set stock it and allow the animals to graze down until the dirt, right? Because that doesn't do any good. So we want to intentionally manage them and rotate them around our pastures in a way that promotes the growth of the grasses and allows plenty of time for rest in between. So what that generally means is kind of high intensity grazing. So packing a lot of animals into a relatively small space, but for a very short period of time, and then allowing an extended period of rest.
And why don't we do that now with commodity beef? I mean, I think most of my readers know that animals are grazed on grass for a period of time, beef, normally around the first year, and then often sent to a feedlot. But why did we change going from a much more natural or environmentally mimicking grazing pattern, like watching the bison that are naturally out there on the prairie, to this more restrictive, confined grazing, and then now feedlotting?
So it essentially comes down to trying to maximize profits and minimize costs of goods, right? So rotational grazing or regenerative agriculture is fairly labor intensive, especially the upstart. What we're looking at from kind of the industrial model is, like you said, all beef is grazed on grass, right? At some point in their lives, whether it be the first year or the first 2 years. The difference is there's typically, as far like from the industrial model, they take the animals not too long after weaning and move them into a finishing program, which you've designed as a feedlot or a confined animal feeding operation. So that will put on weight on the animal at a much faster rate than kind of a natural way of raising them on pasture for their entire lives on grass. So you're able to churn out animals at a faster rate. So the average animal on a grass finish program, 100% grass finish program, is typically at least 2 years old. So 24 months, like I would say 24 to 27 months is probably the average. The average steer that's processed in a conventional model is generally less than 20 months. So we're looking at like 18 to, let's say, 22 on the high end.
Right.
So you can imagine like the compounding efficacy of the efficiencies that you see by slaughtering animals at 18 months versus 24, right?
And you
Especially
can
when
get them to the same weight, if not bigger, right?
right, exactly. How much of that is actually nutritious protein? We can talk about that too, but
Well, we should. Let's talk about that because I do get a little bit of feedback from some of my listeners that, I shouldn't beat up on traditional and conventional farmers. I know how hard agriculture is. I grew up in an agricultural community. I've worked in dairy and hatcheries, and then being in the butcher industry, we sourced directly from our ranchers. So I visited a lot of our ranchers who were doing this regenerative model, which
right.
is, like you said, more labor intensive. Why would a rancher choose this model over the more traditional models that grow the animals faster and more profitably, and with lower cost of goods?
Long term, it does relieve the rancher or the farmer, at least in theory, of the burden of using chemical inputs and the cost of feed in their operations. So ultimately, once you are up and running in a regenerative model, not only are you in a position to charge more for your product, because it is of a higher value, it has a higher nutrient density, it's gonna drive more value on the shelf. But you've also eliminated the costs of these inputs in your operation. So while you may not be able to produce as much beef, your yield and your margin is in a much better position.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely saw that with some of my ranchers years ago. I'm sure I'll get a couple of listeners chiming in that it's hard to make a buck in the regenerative ag industry. Hopefully, more companies like yours continue to buy the product. But the part that we kind of skipped over was the environmental impact that traditionally raised beef has, globally. And of course, I think there's a lot of information out there, some very accurate, some that folks have challenged that says that beef is kind of the boogeyman of agriculture. And this started back in the 70s. I wrote a whole series of posts on the newsletter about this, really dispelling these myths that beef inherently is bad, because really what's happened is beef has been raised in a way that relies on petrochemicals and hormones and antibiotics, and has become so energy intensive that and environment degrading in the way that we do it traditionally, that it really doesn't make sense to scale that model any larger than it already has become. Why does regenerative agriculture reverse that? Because I mean, or does it even? I mean, why do you see regenerative agriculture as a direction to move toward in terms of beef consumption?
So I think there are a couple ways to look at it. The greater implications of the industrial model or the grain finish model or the CAFO model, obviously there's the humane question, right? It's like, is it humane to stick cattle, shoulder to shoulder in a confined lot and force grains down their gullet? Probably not. These animals weren't designed to eat this type of product, to eat this type of feed. So there's implications from kind of like an anatomical biological level. And a lot of people point to increased methane production, right? Because they're eating things that they shouldn't be, right? These are ruminant animals that were, evolved on grasses and pastures and grazing lands. And they're designed to convert the energy from grasses that we as humans or other predators cannot digest. They process it and they turn it into nutrient-dense food that we then can actually process and consume and benefit from. I think the greater implications of that aren't the cows themselves, but the feed production that is required to perpetuate this industry, right? So we're looking at monocrop production of corn and soy in order to produce the feed that is necessary in a confined animal feeding operation, right? So then you have the implications of chemical inputs on the land, topsoil loss, biodiversity loss, ecological degradation of the land through the production of the feed itself, which I don't feel like people talk enough about, to be honest. I mean, I think Force of Nature talks a lot about, but in general, when they kind of villainize beef, they're not villainizing the feed, they're villainizing the beef for some reason. But really the greater implication is the growing of these crops in order to feed the animals, not necessarily the animals themselves.
How do cows sequester carbon?
Okay, so the cows don't sequester the carbon, but the grasses that they help to make healthy and the plant life that they help to make healthy are what pulls the carbon from the atmosphere into the soil and keeps it there. And one of the tenets of regenerative agriculture is kind of like no exposed topsoil, right? Because as soon as you expose topsoil, you're exposing it to erosion. And if managed properly, cows feeding on grazing lands and grasses, and not just grasses, but we're talking legumes, other forage that these animals can digest and process and convert into nutrient dense foods. They actually stimulate the growth of this plant life, and the end result is more water retention, sequestering carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked to folks who are part of the Marin Soil Project, which is the Marin County Soil Project, which has shown more and more scientific data that they're actually able to sequester carbon. It made sense to me from the beginning, quite honestly, because if you just look at the fact that there were so many more grass-eating animals on the Great Plains of North America before we even got here than there are today. And folks are like, well, how, if we keep having more and more beef on on the land, it's going to cause more methane. But I'm sure the 100 million bison that were roaming around 40,000 years ago were producing probably just as much methane, and it wasn't causing global warming. So I do think there's an art and a logic to this science. But it's also expensive. And you talked about that a little bit before. The margins are higher for our regenerative ranchers, but the cost to the consumer is much higher. What does the future of regenerative agriculture mean if it's just going to cost more? And already food prices are through the roof for most people.
Right. Yeah, and honestly, I have a hard time, answering this question every time it's proposed to me. I feel like I rehearse it over and over again, and I feel like it, personally, it's I'm not rich. Let's just be honest. Like, I'm very privileged. I have a great life. I love my job. I love my family. But I'm not out there like, blowing all my money at super high-end grocery stores, right? I'm a conscious consumer. I'm a creative consumer. I do prioritize my health and the things that I eat and the things that I put in my body, and therefore I am buying typically slightly more expensive groceries and slightly more expensive meat, particularly. That being said, I mean, I'm not out there buying ribeyes every week, right? I get a little bit more creative with my cooking. I get a little bit more creative with my consumption. So part of it is that. Part of it is priorities for sure. But yeah, it is. I mean, it's probably the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome is the cost of production, and there's a lot of macro and microeconomics that go into it. For one, when you're talking about regenerative agriculture and the way that we operate, we're talking about small producers. We're talking about independent farms. We're not talking about massive corporations that have centralized and vertically integrated the entire operation, save for the riskiest part, which is the ranching, right? They've left that to the rancher, and then they've taken over the lowest risk and the rest of the supply chain. So there are a lot of inefficiencies in the way that regenerative agriculture is operating currently. And I think if we can continue down this path and grow the industry, we will see greater efficiencies. I don't know that we're going to get any cheaper, but the fact of the matter is nothing is getting any cheaper. And conventionally raised beef is actually higher than it's ever been. And it's never been as close in cost to regeneratively raised meat. So if you really want to split hairs on it, like let's talk about the long-term effects of eating, higher caloric content and lower nutrient dense foods.
Well, yeah, tell me about that. So you're basically saying that because the way the animals are raised, conventional beef has lower nutritional value than regenerative beef?
Yeah, so I mean there's a lot of things we can point to. So we were talking about the age of the beef, right? So we're talking about more mature beef. This gives times to store vitamins and minerals in the meat and the fat. And a lot of times you'll look at kind of an older animal versus a younger animal, and you notice that the older animal has a yellower fat, right? I'm sure you've seen
Sure.
this in the butchery world. It's very common. It's more common in grass-fed beef specifically, and that's from beta carotene being stored up in the fat over time. I actually just saw a picture the other day that kind of a butcher acquaintance colleague of mine posted. It was the same breed, the same pastures, and I think it was like a 24-month-old animal versus like a 32-month-old animal. And the 32-month-old animal had, bright yellow fat, and the other animal had like mostly white, kind of like yellow tinged fat. And this is just a matter of about 8 months or so, like that.
Right.
So, we're talking about significant differences just over the course of half a year. You're also talking about something that's been eating kind of like a high starch, high sugar, high caloric diet in the conventional model versus something that's, vitamin and nutrient dense, such as grass and diverse forage. So you end up with a product that pound for pound is going to have a higher calorie content versus protein content, right? So you're going to fill up on these like high calorie, low nutrient dense foods versus when you eat a leaner animal, such as a grass-fed beef, right, is going to produce a leaner meat, right? So you're not filling up on all this high caloric fat. You're filling up on nutrient dense meat. I think that's about as deep into the science as I can probably get confidently.
Sure. Don't worry, I'm not expecting you. You're not a nutritionist, so we don't have. But I do think.
Yeah, I've been in the industry for so long. Like I have become such a jack of all trades in the in the beef industry because I started out as a butcher, so I have this experience that's all very anecdotal. And then I've also done my reading, but it's just kind of it's an amalgamation. It's a building of experience over the past 15, almost, 17 years or whatever it is.
Well, and it's a great point too, because I mean, it's a relatively young industry, even though for thousands of years everyone was raising animals in this way. The explosion of medical information and nutritional analysis and scientific research in this area, has always been focused on yield and how do we make them bigger, faster, healthier, more resilient, these animals, rather than are we making them more nutritious? And I think there's lots of data out there, especially in the vegetable and produce world, to show that we're seeing this degradation of nutritional value because we're not feeding the plants natural food. We're using synthetic fertilizers and we're trying to raise them for the attributes that attract the eye, not the belly. And so we're really breeding the taste out of our food. That's another podcast,
But
folks.
applicable, right? I mean, I think at a high level, those are transferable kind of analogies between vegetable production is what you're kind of referring to, and beef or chicken or any sort of like livestock production. The same concepts apply. And I think, we talked about innovation in the space and what I think has been the most innovative kind of developments over the last few years. And I don't know if this is the answer that you really wanted, but I do think the most innovation or the most innovative things to arise out of the last few years is what you're talking about, is this data that is proving our point that not only is this product more nutrient dense if raised the right way, but we're also having positive effect on the soil. So you've got things like Savory's Land to Market initiative with their ecological outcome verification, which is something that we at Force of Nature do on our own in-house. We send verifiers out to all of our properties to do soil testing. And we're not just like calling people up and be like, hey, you got some beef, send it my way. Like we do the vetting process ourselves. We go out and we touch the ground. We touch grass, if you will. I think the greatest innovation for our space is the data and the science behind the nutrient density and the ecological outcomes that we're producing via these regenerative practices. It's amazing. And it's giving validity to what a lot of us have known to be true for a long time, right? I think you can empathize. I've been in the industry in this kind of like tiny little niche corner of the industry for 15 years. And I think for one, it's a very frustrating position to be in. But on the other hand, it gives me a lot of hope because it's very enlightening. I've seen how far we've come and how much we've grown since I got out of college and 2009 or whatever it was. So
yeah, I agree. We've come a long way. One of the things that I've seen repeatedly, though, throughout that journey is greenwashing. And actually, my friends at Pasture Bird, they just announced, I just saw on social media yesterday that the USDA has finally put a little bit more pressure on some of the marketing terms that are used in the poultry market, which is probably one of the biggest offenders of greenwashing. I feel like, you hear these terms free range, pasture raised, and really what we're talking about is birds raised just like every other confined feedlot. These are indoors their whole life, but there's a little door at one end that opens up into like a putting green of grass that has no food in it. It probably has, some predators out there, or at least some noises that would keep birds from wanting to go out there. And it really restricts or discourages the animals from even going outside. Lots of regenerative poultry ranchers have been complaining about this for years. And I guess the USDA finally said that pasture raised has to mean that the animals are on pasture for most of their life. And I think they defined pasture as something like vegetative rooted organisms or something. So no astroturf or plastic out there. But what
or
are
just
you
like dirt.
Yeah, or dirt. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What are you seeing as other examples of greenwashing in the regenerative agriculture space? And how do you guys protect your business from, damaging your reputation?
Yeah. As you can imagine, I think this is probably one of the greatest frustrations of my life. Being on, being on the side that I believe is telling the truth. But it's also it's one of our biggest priorities right now as a company. Is how do we separate ourselves from the folks that are co-opting regenerative and ultimately diluting its value, right? They're like, they're pointing to some cows in the field and like, look, I graze my animals. That must mean they're grass fed. That must mean they're regenerative. All right, let's slap a regenerative label on there. Call it a day, charge an extra $1. Like, that is not that is not what we are doing. And I will be the first to tell you that that's not what we're doing. And if we were doing that, I would not be working here. So I think ultimately there are third-party certifications out there that I think have some value. In my opinion, the only way to show people is to show people, right? Practice what I like to call radical transparency. Like, we are doing the right thing. We are working with land stewards that are truly doing what they are claiming to do, because we go there and we vet it for ourselves. We have been on every single ranch, maybe not me personally, I've been on a couple. But a representative from our company has been on every single ranch that we source from. Being able to show people that, I think, is really the only way to do it. If a company is out there and they are not willing to be more transparent about their practices or their procurement policies or their producers themselves, then it's likely they are ashamed of what they were doing. And that is just genuinely how I feel. If you're not willing to show the people what you're doing, there's a reason why. So, Force of Nature, we have pretty transparent marketing. We go out to our ranches, we post content on our ranches. We're going to be doing more of that in the future. That is part of our strategy moving forward to kind of separate ourselves from the greenwashing. Personally, I don't feel like legislation is the path forward. I think that's kind of out of the playbook of the Big Four and not something that we necessarily have the leverage to wield at this point. Nor do I really have much faith in the USDA or the FDA to really enforce anything that they say they're going to do. They're notoriously underfunded services and organizations. And ultimately, like I said, the Big Four is really the one that are really kind of like the group that tries to lobby and leverage legislation to benefit them. So do I have much faith in any of the standards that the USDA puts forth for raising livestock to really be upheld or not diluted in the future? Like, no, not really. I mean, I think, and that's why I think third-party certifiers are so important in the industry.
Well, what are some of those certifiers? I guess the question is, when folks are looking to buy product and let's say they can't get Force of Nature at their grocery store, what would you suggest they look out for when they're buying beef? Well, let's stick with beef because I think there's so many different nuances with each protein. But how do they know what they're looking at?
Sure. Okay, there's a lot of levels here. First and foremost, my recommendation to anybody looking to be a little bit more selective or a little bit more engaged with the products that they're buying is either A, buy direct from a rancher or a farmer, or B, buy direct from a butcher that is sourcing directly from a rancher or a farmer in their community, right? You can decide for yourself if you're comfortable with their practices. I think having conversations with people that are actually selling you the product or actually raising the product themselves is the best way to educate yourself. If you don't have that available to you, which a lot of people don't, I do think Force of Nature is the next best thing. We are in 4,000 stores across the country, so it's fairly unlikely that we are not nearby wherever your listeners are, especially if you're in Southern California. But I will say, all right, if you don't have Force of Nature available to you, you don't have a butcher shop available to you, can't buy direct from the farmer, you're going out into a relatively conventional market and looking for grass-fed beef, right? Well, first thing to know is there's a difference between grass-fed and 100% grass-fed as far as the USDA is concerned and FSIS is concerned. So grass-fed can mean that it is fed a ration of grain towards the end of its life. So if it's likely that if a company is claiming grass-fed, but they're not claiming 100% grass-fed, that it is getting some sort of supplemental grain toward finishing stages of its life.
Why does the
100
USDA make this so difficult? I mean, we could just say, there's one label for one type and one label for the other, because these are different products and they're differentiated by price. So
yeah,
what I tell people is unfortunately, you can tell by price when they're because some of them, will say grass fed and they'll say pasture raised, or they'll say 100% natural. And really, what they're doing is just rebranding existing commodity beef with a label that looks like a buyer who's more environmentally conscious. It's
right.
green, or it's got trees in the background, or there's, a recycle sign on it or something. So, what is your opinion on grass finished?
So grass finish would imply 100% grass fed. And typically, if it's going to say 100% grass fed, it would often say grass finished as well. There's so many things we can talk about. You mentioned natural, which is like doesn't mean anything, literally means nothing. You can talk about antibiotic free, which meat in the United States, if it's been administered antibiotics at any point in its life, it needs to have run through its system fully before it's slaughtered and put into market. Therefore, technically, all meat that is on the grocery store shelf is quote unquote antibiotic free. Now, raised without antibiotics or never ever NAE is another story. That means that there's never been antibiotics administered to this animal at any point in its life. So antibiotic free is another one that people throw on packaging that literally means nothing.
I mean, I'll say this. You guys really impressed me with the transparency on your website and all the questions that you answered in your FAQ. If folks want to check that out, they should definitely go to your website. They'll get a great kind of tutorial on the challenges of buying beef on the consumer packaged goods market and the benefits of regenerative agriculture.
And if you want to go really deep, I would say our social media is a really great source for education on the subject as well. More so than our FAQs on the website, but although our FAQs are great.
Yeah, I mean, Savory Institute you mentioned is a great one, and now there's several organizations. I'll include that in the article that goes along with this podcast, so folks can have some hyperlinks. But when we're talking about purchasing at the store, what else should we be concerned about as a red flag? I mean, the consumer packaged goods market is so nimble. I feel like when Omnivore's Dilemma came out and Michael Pollan said grass finished versus grass fed, suddenly everybody had some kind of reference to grass. And when I would talk to friends or customers when we had the butcher shop, people really felt that that was enough to confirm for them what products were good to buy. Now I can imagine with regenerative agriculture, there's probably all kinds of other greenwashing terms or phrases or sleight of hand. What are you seeing in the consumer packaged goods space that's kind of getting you concerned or making things nervous about how you differentiate your product from others?
First and foremost, there are no standards according to the USDA FSIS for regenerative. So you can claim regenerative without really having any supporting documentation. So really anybody can claim regenerative, which is problematic, obviously. I think another one that is a red flag for me that may not seem like a red flag to most is carbon neutral. If somebody is claiming carbon neutral on their packaging, it is more than likely that they are buying carbon credits in order to offset their emissions. So, and it doesn't necessarily mean that their raising practices are any different than kind of like conventional models.
And we just talked last month about carbon credits. So
yeah.
That's another tool in the toolbox. But to your point, it doesn't necessarily mean the ranchers are doing anything different with how they raise the animals. And so the nutritional benefit, the caloric value, all of that could be different.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I think that's, in my opinion, a huge red flag. So again, like I said, it's like our greatest frustration, but also maybe our highest priority right now is like, how do we move forward now that there is so much greenwashing of regenerative out there, and we need to set ourselves apart. Like, if we're not going to immediately align ourselves with a specific regenerative third-party certification like ROC or Regenify or Savory's Land of Market, then what are we going to do in the short term until one of these certifying bodies or a new certifying body like bubbles to the surface that we do feel strongly about? And that's the conversation that we're having currently. So you'll probably see some decisions made with that regard
Maybe
here in the
because of this
next.
podcast, maybe Enlightened Omnivore will be the tipping point for you.
No, I can tell you that we've been having conversations about this for months. It's nothing new. We just we want to be intentional about how we move forward and how we market ourselves, and we don't want to dilute our brand or our name or what we're doing, because we really do believe that we're best in class and we're a step above almost every company out there. Especially, I mean, we are 100% a step above any of these conventional industrial models. So yeah, we just don't want to jump to any we don't want to jump down any rabbit holes or make any decisions too rashly. We want to be intentional. We want to feel really good and firm in our decision when we move forward. So, it's not going to be overnight, but we're going to make a decision and we're going to start moving forward in some way.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about overseas meat. So many meat companies are buying grass-finished beef from other countries, especially Australia, which I think a lot of people would be surprised because it's halfway around the world. And I believe you guys buy a large portion of your product from Australia. Can the U.S. raise enough grass-finished beef to feed all of us? Why are you and many other companies buying what is a really fantastic quality product that's responsibly raised, but is tens of thousands of miles away from us?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways I can answer this. First of all, climate change is a global crisis, right? It's not a domestic crisis. So if we can have positive impact on producers halfway around the world, we see that as a good thing. I do understand the argument for the emissions of transporting product halfway around the world. And I think that all I'll say is that I believe that the long-term pros outweigh the short-term cons. An anecdotal example of kind of the impact we're having on a pretty large scale in Australia. These guys went out and they took it upon themselves and took the cost upon themselves to verify over 100,000 acres for ecological outcome verification. And you want to talk about impact, like we can't have that level of impact in the United States currently. You did ask whether or not I believe the United States can produce enough grass-fed beef to feed the United States. And I think please don't take offense, I think it's a little bit of a reductive question. First of all, the US beef industry was never designed to feed just the United States, at least not in the last half a century. The US exported something like $10 billion worth of beef last year. So we're not producing beef just for the United States, nor is Australia producing beef just for Australia. So we're a global economy. We're operating under a global crisis. Like, let's approach it globally is kind of my opinion. And then if you want to talk about our commitment to the domestic beef and kind of raising the regenerative standard here, our sourcing of imported beef allows us to rise the tides on domestic ships.
And I certainly appreciate that this is a global market and there's many countries around the world that have to import much of their food. We're in a very lucky position as the United States that we've got a lot of land and we've got a climate that's actually very conducive to growing lots and lots of food. What makes Australia better at raising grass-finished beef?
For one, they've been doing it longer. They definitely have conventional models there, just like the US. But from a governmental and legislative regulatory standpoint, grass-fed beef is a bit more mature there. The grass-fed beef industry is more mature in a lot of ways, and it's supported a bit more from a governmental standpoint than the US. The one other thing I'll say about Australia is that it's roughly the size of the United States with the population of Texas. So
A lot more room for those cows.
think about how much space they got for those cows Granted, a lot of the country is desert and you can't actually raise animals there, but fun fact for you.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I've heard the same thing. Australia has an amazing model, and I have heard from some thought leaders in this space that we're starting to kind of borrow from their playbook. USDA is kind of a toothless entity, when it wants to make regulatory change, when it wants to support the status quo, things go really well.
Yeah.
But I think that's where we got to start. And I won't get on my soapbox today, but I've been talking about policy for years and years. It's something that is near and dear to my heart. I don't think we should be an over litigated society, but when it comes to food and when it comes to issues that are really based, the decision making is exclusively on profit. This isn't a safety issue to human beings. It's actually better for the environment. It's better for our healthcare. But the reason why we're choosing the different direction is because it's more costly. And there's lots of things we invest in this country that don't make financial sense. But we do it because it's for the greater good. And so I think, we can't, turn into the nanny state. But in this case, I think legislation and policy, like what we're seeing with pasture raised poultry, for example, are a step in the right direction. And Australia's got us beat in spades. So
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, I hear you, and we can have that conversation. I'm happy to debate you. I don't think policy shouldn't be enacted to support what we're doing, but I don't think it should come first, or I don't think it needs to come first, rather. I'm not going to say it shouldn't come first. I don't think it needs to come first. I think what needs to come first is we need to take enough of the market share away from these industrial models in order to convince or sway the general public to want what we're offering. And people do want what we're offering. I think the meteoric growth of our company over 4 or 5 years is proof enough that it's all the proof I need.
well, let's talk about processing. And that in the industry is kind of a euphemism for the slaughterhouse. But
Sure.
processing has always been a bottleneck. And when we looked at all the shortages during COVID, when we look at, how only a handful of companies really control the supply of proteins to the US market, slaughterhouses and the processing plants and the packaging of this meat is handled in fewer and fewer hands every year. How do you guys handle that working with these smaller scale ranchers? And what are you anticipating are the changes or improvements or challenges in the years ahead?
Yeah, so I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's hard. It's very hard, and I think we manage it much like we manage our producer relationships and honestly our retail relationships, and that's intentionally, and we are very involved, right? Weekly, if not daily, calls with our packers and processors. And like you said, we're pretty committed to continuing to work with smaller to mid-sized regional processors. And a lot of these processors, some of them are a little antiquated. They're not as well funded as these giant vertically integrated processors of JBS or Tyson. So just like the ranching side of regenerative agriculture, it's a little less efficient, right? They don't necessarily have the capabilities or the standards that we're looking for, and we have very high standards for our products. We have standards comparable to JBS and Tyson, right? However, we're not necessarily working with producers that have the capabilities of affecting those standards. So it's a lot of very intentional relationship building on that level. In order to keep up with our demand, I feel like we're constantly onboarding new processors. And again, I'm not on the operations side of the business. I just kind of see about it or hear about it. But going back, I mean, I think we're committed to continuing to work with smaller, mid-sized regional processors and packers, and part of that is our, I would say, side quest of decentralizing the meat industry. It's not part of our mission statement, but I think it's inherent in there, and part of that is with the processing side as well.
If we're looking at the scalability of this model of, like you just said it earlier, how do you take market share away from the larger factory farmed beef producers And how do you demonstrate that there is a viable market here? You've seen lots of growth in the last several years. In the 10 years I've been in the industry, I saw plenty of growth and awareness. But I have seen some real strategic moves by the big players to either box out smaller players or make it hard for slaughterhouses and processors to open in communities, putting all these rules and restrictions on these smaller players that are really designed to help the big guys process more volume and more flow, but make it incredibly expensive for anyone who's in a startup phase or who has a small mom and pop operation to really make ends meet. So I would think that that's a real risk to your business model, because you guys aren't at the size where you can process with, one of the bigger players, not yet, at least. I think every year, hundreds of abattoirs and small processors are closing their doors or aging out. No one wants to do this business when the parents or the grandparents retire because, it's a challenging industry. What are you seeing that, and what are you guys doing about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with. I was going to tell you a little bit of the story. There's a small abattoir 10 miles from where I grew up that has been for sale for, I think, as long as I can remember.
Right?
And I actually considered briefly going, like, partnering with somebody and buying it. And I thought about the day-to-day operations of running an abattoir, and I was like, I don't know if I want that to be my life. Um, so that's just a little side
It's
story
a
for you.
real thing. It's a real
But
thing. And it's no, it doesn't make it any easier, even though folks like you and I who have been in this industry and have been to many processing facilities and know what this is all about and how it can be done responsibly and be done ethically and humanely. But it's still a hard part of the equation. I
yeah,
That's a whole nother conversation, and I don't want to put you on the spot to answer that, but I just feel like when we were in the business, that's one of the reasons why we got out of the wholesale side was that the volumes that we needed were not big enough to find a good processor, and then the smaller processors they could never prioritize our product, and so we had quality issues, we had availability issues. Sometimes we couldn't even deliver the product to the processor to be processed because they were backed up with other folks. I mean, and there's no other options. We had one place within, 100 miles that we could go to for some of our proteins. We looked at the same thing, buying our own place and trying to build it up, and there is a huge headache involved in that and a lot of cost. So,
oh, dude, the liability alone is.
yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Or
I feel like every year we get rid of some problems and take on a whole set of new problems, right? As we grow. But one thing we consider in the future, and I think we likely will consider in the future, is investing in these processors ourselves. I don't mean in like buying them or buying pieces of them. I mean, joint ventures on equipment in order to increase capacity or capabilities. We can pay our processors a reasonable tolling fee so that they can afford to hire talent and retain employees.
what are some of your thoughts on the future of plant-based meats and lab-grown alternatives, in the context of sustainable protein sources?
What future?
Tell me more about that. Why do you say that?
I just lump all of that into ultra processed foods, and I think people are being more and more wary of ultra processed foods with every passing day. I think from a resource allocation perspective, it's not any more sustainable than conventional beef. I think lab grown meat, personally, I don't want to eat it, and I think a lot of people would probably agree with me. And I can't imagine a world in which that is less resource intensive than just raising animals on pasture. And then, it's kind of pretty subjective, but I honestly just think there's nothing out there that's even remotely palatable. So, we just want to talk about how things taste. Like, I don't know about you, but I've never had a Beyond Burger that I liked.
I'm wondering if you have a story or an anecdote that you like to share about one of the ranchers or some of the work that is being done at the ranches that you guys purchase from.
One story I like to tell people is I'll call it my the my origin story or whatever it is. Yeah, the first farm I ever visited when I started working in the industry as a butcher or a butcher's apprentice was Kinderhook Farm, and they are in Ghent, New York. It's about, I think, like 15, 20 minutes from Hudson, so Hudson Valley. And this was in 2010, I think it was. So the word regenerative wasn't a thing, we called it sustainable. We said it was grass fed. It was also pretty much before the argument over grass fed versus grass finished. And they were doing really incredible things. They were raising beef in a regenerative model, but not calling it that. They had layer hens, sheep, pigs. It just kind of blew my mind. I mean, one thing that I was told early on is if you go onto a farm and it doesn't smell good, then they're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And I think I was enamored by so many different things. The farmer, for one, is still one of my dear friends. And I'm visited him last year. I'm planning on visiting him again this year. It was so pastoral and kind of like, it was exactly what you imagine when you imagine like where you want your food to come from, right? And it was so clean, and it just felt so good. It felt like I was being immersed in nature, although I was on like a very domestic farm. And I remember laying in a hammock after we got the tour, and this was before I kind of really dedicated my life to the industry or really had made any decisions about what I saw as my professional trajectory in life. And laying in a hammock, and I was thinking to myself, like, this is it. This is the kind of thing that I want to support and I want to be a part of forever. I can't imagine doing anything else. And I was 22 years old. And I think that was a pretty pivotal moment for me. And I'll never forget that. So that was amazing. I've spent a fair amount of time at Stemple Creek recently, and I've grown to really, really admire and appreciate Warren Poncha as both a land steward and a businessman, and just an incredible human being. Honestly, if you ever get a chance to meet him, then definitely take that opportunity.
Oh yeah, no, Lauren and I go way back at Electric City Butcher, and in fact, he's going to be
Okay, I thought you might.
yeah, he's going to be coming on the show later on this year, either the end of the year or the first part of next. But yeah, that's a great ranch to check out, Stemple Creek out in Petaluma.
Oh my God, he's gonna put me to shame, man. That guy. He's so charismatic and so knowledgeable, and just one of the most authentic human beings I've ever met in my life. Yeah, really enjoy hanging out with that guy.
Well, he makes great beef too, so you can like his product as well. So,
Yeah,
it comes with the territory. He's a good man who makes good product. So, if you could change one thing about the way we think about food or the way we farm it, what would it be?
To be honest, I think the overwhelming majority of us overcomplicate it. We overcomplicate our diets. We overcomplicate, making these decisions as far as where we're sourcing product, how we're buying our product, even how we're raising our product. And ultimately it comes down to, eat a diverse diet of whole foods and try to avoid toxic chemicals, right?
Yep.
And you can take that same theory and apply it to farming, and you pretty much got regenerative agriculture. It's like raise diverse crops, avoid toxic chemicals. Like, that's it. It's as easy as that. And obviously, this is a little bit in jest. It's super reductive of a very complex system, but I think for the overwhelming majority of us on this planet, like, that's all we need to think about. And if we're doing those things, then we're probably, we're checking most of the boxes.
What's your favorite thing to cook?
Much to my wife's chagrin, I am a big like stews and braises guy, like heavy meals.
What's wrong with those? This is the perfect time of year to start that up.
Oh, I know. And one thing I make a lot that she does love, she likes all of it. It all tastes good. I think she doesn't like as heavy meals as I like. You know what I mean? I like fatty, unctuous stuff. So I make ramen a lot, which may come as a surprise as like a white guy from Virginia, but I do make ramen a lot. So that's something that we really enjoyed having together.
Well, how do you make your ramen broth?
If I'm really, I phone it in a lot, to be honest. I always have some pork or chicken broth in the freezer that I've made. So I'll usually kind of like doctor that up at the last minute because I don't have the forethought to actually like spend 3 days making a tonkatsu. But I'll go down the rabbit hole sometimes. I think what people don't realize or appreciate is that ramen is a real like kitchen sink meal.
Totally.
You know what I mean? Like I'll go in the fridge, and as long as I got ramen noodles, I probably got enough other stuff that I can whip up a bowl.
That's what's great about soup. I don't know why Americans don't eat more soup, but soup is like the garbage bag of food. It's like you just put anything in there, and as long as the broth is good and there's salt, it's delicious.
And I think the other thing that I really appreciate about making these types of meals is it's really like you build it, right? You build it from the ground up.
Yeah.
And you're not whipping something up real quick. You have to take care and be intentional, and you have to season every little piece and kind of build it up over time. And then the best part about stews, they're better the next day.
Leftovers. Totally. Well, that's a perfect segue because this week I'm putting out a post on ossobuco, which is
nice.
one of my favorite recipes. So, well, this has been awesome, James. I really appreciate you taking the time today and really giving us a little tutorial, not only on regenerative agriculture, but on the challenges of growing this industry to help us save the planet when it comes to raising proteins. Is there anything else you wanted to share today before we close?
Oh man, I don't know. Honestly, I feel like between you and me, I black out when I do these podcasts, and I'm like, what did I even talk about? I probably just confuse these people. I think people are becoming more educated and more knowledgeable about these things. It's pretty evident. I mean, it's evident in the success of Force of Nature up to this point. And unfortunately, it's going to take more work on the consumer to continue having conversations, continue to educate themselves, and really think consciously about how they're consuming and how they're eating and who they're supporting. And I mean that from who they're supporting is as far as kind of like the businesses that are selling them product and the producers themselves. If you want your farmers to be taken care of financially, then buy from an independent producer. Let me tell you, the industrial model is exploitative. It does not take care of ranchers. It puts all of the risk on them while taking all the profits. And you want to talk about sustainability, it's not sustainable. So there's an expiration date on the industrial model. When it is, I don't know, but it's coming. So keep that in mind.
Well, I'll leave it there. I hope that expiration date is sooner rather than later. And I hope we see more companies out there like Force of Nature fighting the good fight. So thank you, James, so much. Remember, everybody, everything in moderation here at Enlightened Omnivore, including, all the great products over at Force of Nature. And let's go out and continue to try to change the world. And that wraps up another episode of Enlightened Omnivore. A special thanks to all my subscribers for listening in this week. You can all read more about everything omnivorous on my weekly Substack newsletter found at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com. Join me next month as we continue to uncover the stories behind our food and the new ways we can live sustainably together. Thank you for tuning in. This is Steve Sabaker reminding you to savor every bite and eat mindfully. Until next time, keep it balanced and stay enlightened. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation.